Welcome everyone to our third book discussion this season. As you know, we are discussing Henry Bradley Plant, The Gilded Age Dreams for Florida and the South by Canter Brown Jr. This is definitely a scholarly publication, thanks to our friend Gay Darsie, who discovered this wonderful author and this book. And we think that you all are going to really enjoy her summary. First of all, I introduce myself, Pat Agles. Thank you for being with us. I say thank you to Ferguson Skipper Law Firm in Sarasota as our sponsor. Gay Darsie is our moderator. And of course, Crystal Diff, our executive director and our Zoom host. Crystal, do you want to give a little brief tutorial?
Yes, I just want to let everybody know that I have you all muted as you're coming into the room. Last time, and I think we've done pretty well with all of our book discussions so far, and most of you are aware on how to mute and unmute yourselves when you are talking. Obviously, we want to be respectful to whoever is talking, so please don't interrupt each other, which I don't think we've ever had an issue with. We're going to make sure that Gay has the floor so that she can talk to you and let you know her notes, her perspective on what she learned from this book, and then we'll open it up as we move along to you all, whether you want to comment, ask questions, and all of that. If you have an issue and you do not know how to mute or unmute yourself, you can physically just raise your hand and I'll try to see you, or you can use the chat. I'll be checking the chat box. And also there's a little reactions icon. So at the bottom of your screen, there's reactions. It's a little happy face. If you click on that, you can actually raise your hand and I'll see you inside of the Zoom room. Again, you can unmute yourselves if you would like to ask a question, as long as, again, we're not talking over each other. And I'll just be making sure that everybody is muted throughout so that we don't get any background noise. All right. Does anybody have any questions about any of that before we begin? All right. I'm going to pass it on. Pat, did you have anything else to say? You want to do another?
Just briefly, we begin usually with our author biography, and then we move right into the book summary with Gay, and then we will open it with some discussion points, and we hope that you'll join us. We look forward to that very much. So I'll begin with our author, Canter Brown Jr. Canter Brown has authored or co-authored a score of works touching upon Florida, the Southeast and the South. Subjects have included the frontier, the Florida Republican Party founder and governor, Ocean Hart, African-American office holders in the post-Civil War era, the diversity of women's experiences in the South, Victorian era author and editor Mary Edwards Bryan, the Florida Supreme Court, the Southern States Energy Board, religious history, and numerous other topics. His recent publication of this biography of Plant, The Gilded Age, is what we will be discussing today. With his colleague Larry E. Rivers of Florida A&M University, he presently is finalizing a biography of Florida native and African Methodist Episcopal Church Bishop Abram Grant. Brown's work has earned local, state, regional, and national awards, including the American Association for State and Local History Association Certificate of Merit, the Florida Historical Society's Rembert, Patrick, and Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Prizes, the Southern Jewish Historical Society's B.H. Levy Award. Brown has received the degrees of Bachelor of Arts, Doctor of Philosophy, and Juris Doctor at Florida State, He also studied at the University of Florida under Dr. Samuel Proctor, longtime editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. And now I leave you with Gay.
Thanks, Pat. Let me extend some apologies to everybody who had difficulty acquiring this book. And if you had difficulty reading the book, I too had difficulty, not because there was anything wrong with the book. The fact was almost every sentence was loaded with a nugget of information, and I didn't want to miss any of it. So I probably took over 50 pages of notes just to try to get all the information I could in a correct order to present to you. The book draws heavily on George Smythe, and you don't know this at the beginning. It's revealed much later in the book. Smythe had been commissioned by Plant several years before Plant's death to write a friendly biography about Plant, because Plant had already been vilified in the popular press by William Randolph Hearst of the New York Tribune. So Plant wanted to get his own version out there. When Smythe's book was released, it was released apparently with a rather tepid response. Not to sugarcoat Henry Bradley Plant, he has been listed as one of the 24 robber barons of the 19th century. And of those robber barons, I just added them up. I think about 8 of them were all into the railroad business. The next highest amount was finance. About 6 were in finance and 3 were in steel. Obviously, the 19th century was a year of growth, or a century of growth for the United States, and maybe it's appropriate that those movers and shakers would be the ones identified as the robber barons. The book is 14 chapters in length. It doesn't really get to Florida until about the 9th chapter. But in order to understand Henry Bradley Plant, we need to know something about how he got to railroads in Florida. Plant was born in 1819 in the town of Branford, Connecticut, located along Long Island Sound. His father was a farmer, albeit not a very successful farmer, and his father died before Plant was 6 years old. Thereafter, Plant and his mother tried to farm the farm, but they weren't very successful at that either. Plant's mother remarried to a man named Philemon Hoadley, who lived in the western edge of New York State. Hoadley had a special needs child, and he needed a wife. So the family moved 350 miles to the western part of New York. Hoadley was very involved in the church. It was sort of a combination of the Congregationalists and Presbyterians. And the Second Great Awakening was about them, and it was very emotional. And Plant took away from that he didn't want to be involved in the emotionalism and the activities of the church. Hoadley fell out with the church. He had some kind of a breakdown. About that time, his wife, Plant's mother, she had another child, and Hoadley takes off for Jamaica and Cuba, at which point Mom moves the family back to Branford to stay with her family. After Hoadley returned from his sojourn, the family again moved to the western part of New York, but not for very long. And then they moved back to New Haven. In New Haven, Plant was enrolled in the Lancasterian school, from which he did not graduate, but it did expand his ability to think for himself. Several of his boyhood friends moved to New Haven, James Edward English and Lorenzo Blackstone, and they remained friends throughout Plant's life. Yes? Plant obtained a position on the New Haven Steamship Company ship known as the New York, which was then purchased by Cornelius Vanderbilt. As an aside, Vanderbilt had gotten into the shipping business at the age of 11. He was a native of Staten Island. And in Plant's view, Vanderbilt was a cutthroat businessman. And as evidenced by several hours after the New York was purchased by Vanderbilt, it burned itself apart at the wharf. Then Vanderbilt had it refurbished. In the meantime, Plant was working on some of Vanderbilt's slower ships going between New Haven and New York. At that time, the U.S. Mail Service was not really equipped to deal with the commerce that a burgeoning country was beginning to have shipped back and forth. Things such as money, deeds, bills of lading, and such. And so Vanderbilt had put into place baggage rooms, special baggage rooms on these ships that he referred to as express rooms. And at that point, Plant became the express room agent on these Vanderbilt ships that were going back and forth between New York and New Haven. In 1842, Plant took a land-based job with some colleagues who had been friends, and he developed on his own standards of sobriety, economy, and saving. And he really saved, he saved most of his money. He was very good at that. At the age of 23, he married Ellen Elizabeth Blackstone, who was the sister of his longtime friend Lorenzo. In June of 1845, Connecticut banned the sale of spirituous liquors. Well, that put Plant and his partner, Washington Webb, out of business because they had been running rum from the West Indies up to New Haven, and they'd also been storing it in New Haven. So then about that same time, Plant and his wife, Ellen, had a baby, a little boy. In the fall of 1846, Plant and Ellen had heard a sermon condemning sin and sexual pleasures. A few days later, their son died, unknown cause, and Ellen withdrew from society. Apparently, the sermon had quite an effect on her because she did not conceive another child for 6 years. Since Plant's rum running company had failed, he went to work as a messenger for Adams and Company aboard their ships or their trains traveling between New York, Hartford, and New Haven. He was entrusted with carrying and collecting money, deeds, bills of lading, and he was an armed messenger, as most messengers were. At the time of the California Gold Rush, Adams and Company became the San Francisco agent to transport gold to New York and to carry money and goods on the New York and New Haven Railroad, and Plant was the agent on the line. He eventually became a clerk in the office of Adams and Company, and while there, he learned to enjoy the theater, arts, and entertainment. His wife, Ellen, moved to New York. She had a second child, and then she returned to her parents' home. In 1851, Adams and Company secured the U.S. Treasury contract to be the express agent between New York City and the Philadelphia Mint, and Plant was the onboard agent there. At that time, Plant met Edward Sewell Sanford, who later factored in the Civil War. But Plant was dissatisfied with merely working for wages because he saw some of his friends prospering in other ventures. William Dinsmore, who was a principal in the firm of Adams and Company, suggested that Plant explore Florida. So Plant went to Florida. He traveled around the state. The Second Seminole War had just ended. The state had become a state in 1845. He also traveled throughout Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and he was looking for places to establish Adams Express locations. Adams Express consolidated a number of smaller express companies into one in the South. It was an unincorporated joint stock company organized under the laws in New York. That was the same corporate structure utilized by American Express, Wells Fargo Express, and United States Express. And they did this because it would shield their investors from the prying eyes of perhaps state regulators or just curious people. It did expose them to liability. As an aside, and this isn't explained in the book, in the 19th century, in order to become a corporation, you had to get the legislature of the state in which you chose to become incorporated to issue a charter to your organization. And that charter would spell out the rights, the privileges, and the powers that your corporation would have. And for that reason, these entrepreneurs would really befriend their local legislators because they would want a charter issued at some point in their favor. At some point, there was an internal fight about the control of Adams Express. Again, it's unincorporated, so there aren't any referees. They've got to referee themselves. At that time, Plant became a friend with Andrew Carnegie, and from Carnegie, he learned the value of choosing good investments and accepting risk. Plant and his wife moved to Augusta, Georgia, just to try to dull the Yankee label, and they also traveled frequently down to Jacksonville. But he was on the road most of the time to the various Adams Express offices, and he learned management and personnel skills along the way. He became the general superintendent of Adams Express in the South in the 1850s. About that time, just by way of background, Florida had a population of 110,000 people. Approximately half of these people were slaves or they were freed blacks, and the largest towns had a population of less than 1,500. The Third Seminole War erupted, and that stagnated plans then to extend the Florida Railway into Florida. So Florida was on hold, and on behalf of Adams Express, he then turned his attention to facilitating traffic between Memphis and New Orleans on steamer ships. By 1857, Plant began staying in New Orleans through Mardi Gras, which he enjoyed very much. He enjoyed the opera, and he brought his wife there as well. The U.S. mail route got changed from Augusta as the waypoint to Atlanta, so Plant moved his wife to Atlanta. In 1859, other people established a separate Southern Express company, and Plant then hired attorneys to thwart their efforts to obtain a charter from the Alabama legislature, and apparently he was successful. Plant was in attendance at the 1860 National Democratic Convention, which started out being held in Charleston, South Carolina. They couldn't get somebody elected, so they couldn't get somebody nominated. They moved it to Baltimore, and eventually Stephen Douglas became the nominee of the Democratic Party. He, like Lincoln, was from Illinois. About that time, the top executives of Adams Express conferred amongst themselves about what would they do if war broke out between the North and the South. And they resolved that they would continue shipping arms and ammunition from the Northern manufacturers to the South and continue to operate as an express company in the South. Plant didn't believe there would be a war, but sure enough, secession began in December of 1860. Plant negotiated agreements for Adams Express and secured approval that he, as a citizen of New York State, could remain in the South and work on behalf of Adams Express. Adams Express agreed to carry money for the Confederacy for delivery and collected tariffs on behalf of the Confederacy. Plant had a Confederate passport and a pass to move at will throughout the South. Plant and Adams Express President William Dinsmore traveled to Montgomery to meet with the Confederate Treasury Secretary who vouched for them, and they agreed then to absorb the assets of Southern Express Company of Georgia in order to keep Adams Express assets from being confiscated. Plant's wife had been suffering from depression since she lost her first child, and she also had some type of consumption. And Plant had moved her back to Branford and then back to Augusta. And he bought a slave couple in January of 1862 to stay with Ellen. Plant claimed that the couple asked that he purchase them because the owner had planned to sell the husband. Plant's wife died at the end of February 1862 with no cause of death given. She was buried in Augusta, but Plant later had her body exhumed some years later. Interesting footnote, her funeral was presided over by the father of a later president, Woodrow Wilson, Presbyterian family. Plant traveled between North and South, though when he was in the North, he always traveled as a Mr. Harris, which was an arrangement put in place by U.S. Secretary of State William Seward. Seward, as you may recall, was famously known as the individual who caused the United States to buy Alaska, which was then known as Seward's Icebox. Seward's law firm represented Adams Express. Adams Express director Henry Sanford helped secure the services of Allen Pinkerton to serve as Lincoln's protector. Adams Express director E.S. Sanford became the military supervisor of telegraphic messages for the North. Meanwhile, Plant had direct access to top Confederate officials. He routinely knew their military and governmental secrets, and Jefferson Davis appointed Plant's personal lawyer, Thomas Hill Watts, to be the Attorney General for the Confederacy. As the South suffered defeats in 1862, revenues poured into Adams Express, which carried the bulk of all supplies for the Confederacy. Employees of Adams Southern Express were draft exempt because they were considered to be too indispensable, and Plant himself earned considerable money. He invested in Southern railroads. He bought a hotel in Augusta and then leased it to the Confederates to serve as a hospital, and he speculated in cotton. His net worth in 1860 was $3,000. By 1863, it was $240,000. And in 1862, he had deposited $75,000 in cash into a Connecticut bank. Plant left the South via Wilmington, North Carolina in September of 1863, carrying correspondence, presumably for Jefferson Davis. He had elevated some of his key employees to manage the affairs of Southern Express while he was gone. And he traveled then a circuitous route by way of Bermuda, Nova Scotia to Montreal on an errand for Davis. Then he went to Europe with another message for the Confederacy delivered in Ireland. He went to Paris where he saw the opera star Adelina Patti, who he had met years earlier when she had debuted in New York. He went on from there to Italy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Switzerland, and back to Paris. Meanwhile, this war is raging in the United States. In order to re-enter the U.S., he had to execute an oath of allegiance. Well, Plant didn't want the Southerners to find out about this, so he got back into the United States before that new rule went into effect. The Civil War ended April of 1865. After the war ended, Plant and others received funds from their northern associates to form national banks in Georgia and in two parts of Georgia, Augusta and Macon. He then recovered his stored cotton bales and began leasing his Augusta hotel, now to the U.S. Army, to serve as a marshal's office. The Southern railway lines and depots had all been destroyed during the Civil War, and there really was no capital in the South in order to restore these lines. So Plant and Adams Express invested $2 million in Southern railways. Plant also approached individual line owners that he would advance money to them in exchange for free transport of Southern Express messengers. In October of 1865, Southern Express gifted to Plant all the rights south of the Ohio River, subject to some exceptions. Plant and Adams Express president Dinsmore were longtime friends. Dinsmore credited Plant with having developed Southern Express. There were many who questioned this, and this later resulted in a lawsuit, and Plant variously claimed that he paid $300,000 to Adams Express for the Southern Express part of the company. Then there was a claim he'd paid $500,000 as represented by $100,000 promissory notes. And when it finally went to trial, the plaintiffs didn't show up. So the case was dismissed. There were long time rumors that maybe some money had changed hands. Plant had a habit of vanishing to Paris when things would get a little dicey. And after the Civil War, Plant mostly stayed in Connecticut and New York because after the passage of the 1867 Reconstruction Acts, it was really violent in the South. So he stayed in Paris, and he allowed his subordinates mainly to have the personal involvement with running the company Southern Express throughout the South. There were also claims that were going about that Plant had actually been a spy for the North while he was working all through the Civil War for the Confederacy. Plant defended his acquisition of Southern Express. In 1871, the state of Georgia accepted from Plant and others a bid to lease, this is his first railway now that he's really actually acquiring, the Western and Atlantic Railroad Company. A charter to exempt Southern Express from state taxation had stalled in Congress, so I guess Plant was, looking for other avenues to expand his own orbit. At that time, he was a member of the Southern Railway Security System, which included railways in Pennsylvania, Southern and East Coast railways, and they later extended that to Texas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. The Transcontinental Railway was completed in 1870, and Plant joined the board of the Texas Pacific Railway. In the summer of 1872, he became enthralled with the widow Margaret Josephine Loman Birdsall, whose age was 27. Plant was 52 at the time. They married in July of 1873. They were to reside on Fifth Avenue. And curiously, they went on their honeymoon with his son, his mother, and Adams Express president and wife. They went to Europe. While they were there, they learned of the panic of 1873 when J. Cook and Company failed to sell millions of dollars in Northern Pacific Railway bonds. There were a lot of railways in the South that were failing because they had been expanding on speculative credit, and they were mostly in receivership. By the spring of 1874, the Southern Railway Security Company had terminated many of its leases with these failing railways, and it reorganized as the Southern Railway Company, headquartered in Columbia, South Carolina, of which Plant was a vice president. Plant controlled his Southern Express, that venture, and it was a cash cow. That was what was floating his railway acquisitions. The South was beset by yellow fever. In March of 1874, Adams Express created the Expressmen's Mutual Benefit Society. Plant was a vice president. This aid society would pay employee death benefits. Plant spent some of his time in 1874 at the newly constructed Windsor Hotel, which was catty corner from his home on Fifth Avenue in New York. And there he would gather with others such as William Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, J. Pierpont Morgan, Collis Huntington, George Pullman, Andrew Carnegie, George Westinghouse, and Herman Armour. And Mark Twain was a frequent visitor, which is where he debuted his book, The Gilded Age, A Title of Today. That was the origin of the Gilded Age nomenclature. In the fall of 1875, Plant took over as president of Texas Express, tying it closer to his Southern Express. Though the economy was not robust, Plant tended not to lay off employees, and in 1875, he added a $500 cash death benefit to the family for any employee who died. In the fall of 1876, yellow fever once again hit Charleston, Savannah, Brunswick, and Jacksonville. And at that juncture, Plant refunded their medical expenses and paid their burial expenses as well. As an aside, Plant's son, Morton, had always been something of a problem. He was involved with a married woman whose husband assaulted and robbed him. He was a habitual drunk. He abandoned his society wife for a solo trip to Hawaii. He was present when another lady friend of his was murdered, etc., etc. Sounds like a wonderful kid, don't you think? Morton finally came into the fold in 1882 when Morton began serving as a clerk on one of Plant's steamships operating on the Chattahoochee River. In 1878, Florida was largely comprised, or Tampa, Florida was largely comprised of Fort Brooke with only 722 residents, and travel between Jacksonville or St. Augustine cross-state to Tampa was going out into the primal country. Between 1878 and 1880, records reflect that Plant and Margaret traveled together only infrequently. Meanwhile, Plant was agonizing over the death of many of his employees and family members due to yellow fever. Thereafter, Plant extended additional company benefits. He limited his company's operations to stay within the prescribed quarantine limitations. He donated money and supplies to Memphis in unlimited quantities. That was where he had his Overton Hotel. Plant met Henry Morrison Flagler at the Windsor Hotel in 1877 or 78. Flagler was getting ready to move his family to New York, and Plant encouraged Flagler with his wife, who suffered from tuberculosis, to visit Jacksonville, Florida. And that began their long friendship. Along this way, Plant had also been interested in Cuba, but he kept being thwarted by one thing or another. There was a 10 Years' War that began in 1868. There was the failure of the economy in Cuba, as Cuba changed from being a country where slaves were utilized for their agrarian enterprises and they were becoming free people. And for them, then they were going to have to be paid. And Cuba didn't have the wherewithal to pay its employees. And then we have the issues with the rebellions within Cuba, where the less privileged were continually trying to overthrow the government. And this was the very government with which Plant was trying to make deals so that he could build hotels in Cuba. This sort of scenario just spread over about a 30-year period. Let's see, at that time, it was about 1878, Flagler did convince U.S. Postmaster Key to take a tour of Cuba together. And this was of interest to Plant because he wanted to be the exclusive carrier of the U.S. mails and parcels and such between the United States and Cuba. At that time, it was determined that it wasn't ready to start sending mails back and forth between Cuba and the United States. Later in 1878, Plant goes off to Europe by himself. Let's see, in 1879, there was a railway company in Georgia that was ordered by the U.S. Supreme Court to pay back taxes to the state of Georgia. The amount owed was $74,000. The Attorney General for Georgia put the railway up for auction, and Plant was the only person around who had $300,000 in cash to actually buy the railway at the end of the auction. In 1879, Plant helped to organize Southern Bell Telephone and Telegraph Company and became a director. He bought some steamboats to run on the Chattahoochee River and a passenger and freight boats to serve the Panhandle. In early 1880, he began extending the Savannah, Florida and Western Railway line into Jacksonville, and he was utilizing convict labor to clear out portions of the railway across the Okefenokee Swamp. He later regretted that because he essentially was paying these laborers $15 per man per year, and it was considered to be Florida's newest slave laborers. I think it was a true embarrassment for him. In the summer of 1880, Plant acquired another railway, repaired the railway line and connected it to the Waycross and Jacksonville line, and that opened traffic then up to New York City. At one point, he came into competition with the Louisville and Nashville Railway, known frequently in the South as the Long and Nasty. The L&N wanted to extend its lines into Charleston, Savannah, and to open its own express system, which would then compete with Plant. Plant was not having any of that, but he did disappear back to Europe for 4 months. When he got back, L&N had given up its idea of opening its own express company and determined that it would utilize Southern Express across the entire South and that Southern Express could use the L&N lines. Plant then became president of the Expressmen's Aid Society. In January of 1881, Florida Governor Bloxham reached an agreement with a Philadelphia businessman by the name of Hamilton Diston to reclaim 12 million acres of the Everglades, for which Diston would receive half of the land recovered. In June of 1881, the governor reached a deal with Diston to sell 4 million acres of state land for $1/4 an acre, equaling $1 million. And that was enough to pay off a man by the name of Vose for old railway operations. There was a federal injunction in place that had forbidden the state of Florida from selling any land until Vose was paid off. Now, with Diston's purchase of the 4 million acres, Florida was able to sell land again. Also in 1881, Plant built a railway from Live Oak to Rowland's Bluff at the head of the Suwannee River. For that, Plant's company received alternate sections of land on each side of the railway and within 6 miles of the line. Plant undertook beginning another line connecting Live Oak, Tampa, and Charlotte Harbor. About that time, influential news coverage argued that Tampa should be the terminus of this line and the preferred harbor. In 1882, Plant negotiates with South Florida Railway for 3/5 of that company, with Plant providing steamships to travel to Key West and Havana from Tampa. That was part of the deal, apparently. The Connecticut legislature approved incorporation of Plant Investment Company in 1882, and that superseded a $2 million joint stock company. And Henry Flagler was an investor, and for the first time, they were in the corporate structure, which prevented individual liability to investors. Later in 1882, Plant and his wife had a honeymoon. I tell you these things because this man is furiously building this empire, and he keeps going off to Europe for one reason or another. In 1883, a competition ensued to reach Tampa by rail, and there was a prize of land being appropriated by the Florida legislature. Sir Edward Reed was backed by Jay Gould, who was Plant's main competitor. In May, Plant bought the final 2/5 control of the South Florida Railroad. He had previously bought 3/5 in 1882. And he bought that because that railway had a Florida charter that included a grant of 3,840 acres each mile of railroad construction. Reed's company, the Jacksonville, Tampa, and Key West, was already building from Tampa up to the St. Johns River, and it had the same grant as the South Florida Railway, that 3,840 acres for each mile, plus an additional 10,000 acres, but construction between Kissimmee and Tampa had to be completed by January 25th, 1884, and the Jacksonville, Tampa, and Key West Railway had run out of money. So Plant bought that railway, and that included all railroad built in and out of Tampa, and he gained all the land grant provisions for any track built under that charter, and he paid $30,000. His railway had already graded within 100 miles of Tampa at that juncture. Let's see, in December of 1883, Plant and others began a 15-hour trip to reach Tampa. I'm not sure Plant had ever been there. And they went by way of a city that was later renamed Plant City. He wasn't excited about Tampa, but he voiced the opinion that all it needed was a little spirit and energy, which could be fostered by good transportation. Plant returned to Tampa on the now completed Florida Railway, January 25th, 1884. He was described by reporters as being very affable, amenable, made friends where he went. He was quiet. He enjoys direct intercourse with people. He's frank in his expression. He's not apt to say anything about business matters that he should not say. In March of 1884, the Plant Investment Company consolidated all the railway lines that were under Plant's control. And Plant then, PICO, the Plant Investment Company, mortgaged all those companies to New York's Metropolitan Trust for a $6.5 million loan. Plant was a board member of the Metropolitan Trust Company. Plant used the money to enhance rail service to Tampa, and he built steamships for passengers and freight between Tampa and Key West. In 1884, Plant undertook activities to try to gain loyalty within his African-American workforce. He was embarrassed about earlier owning a slave couple and the leasing of convict labor. He was afraid of violent strikes and the attendant financial loss. He recognized the racial climates in Georgia and Florida were deteriorating. Florida had become the Southern per capita leader in lynchings. This was 1884. Plant believed in equal pay for all workers, not differentiated by race, and he undertook to build housing in several of the cities for his Black employees, and he built schools as well. He bought several other railways in this time period. Let's see. In 1886, Flagler's friend, or Plant's friend Flagler, was focused on building the Ponce de Leon and St. Augustine, while Plant was focused on Havana. Flagler became a director of several of Plant's railways, and he joined the Pico board, on which he was an additional investor. Key West burned in April of 1886, destroying Ybor City and Company factory. It burned on April the 1st. By April the 26th, 1886, cigar making commenced once again in Ybor City near Tampa. Vicente Martinez Ybor had purchased 40 acres near Tampa for the Key West Cigar Company, and they just up and moved. Also in 1886, Plant agreed to change his tracks from narrow gauge to standard gauge, thus securing a contract of mail service between Tampa, Key West, and Havana. And that was brought about by Plant's boyhood friend, Jim English, who by that point had become a governor, a congressman, and a senator, and he was a friend of President Cleveland. That was how that mail contract was obtained. Over the winter of 1886-87, Plant was developing hotel plans for Havana. The plans went awry because he couldn't get clean title to the property. His architect and general manager suggested that Plant construct his hotel in Tampa. The work to build a port at Tampa at Brushy Point commenced in August of 1887. Yellow fever caused delays. They extended their railway system 10 miles south to the port of Tampa, where they could bring trains to deep water. A mile-long pier with wharves that reached town was built, along with a hotel known as the Inn and a restaurant and a steamship dock. The Inn was so popular it was twice expanded after opening. Plant's son Morton was married in 1887, was now a trusted express employee, and he held offices in several of the other Plant enterprises. The site for the Tampa Hotel was chosen along the Hillsborough River, and J.A. Wood, began a Moorish design for the hotel. Plant continues his usual gatherings with all of his friends. They would go to Europe together. They would vacation together up east. They would go to Saratoga Springs, the Catskills, whatever. He had sort of a circuit. He would go out and see all of his holdings and such. In the fall of the year, there would be corporate meetings. In the early winter of the year, he would go to New Orleans for Mardi Gras in the probably February, March period. Then he would go to Europe, usually in the spring, and then he'd be back in Branford in New York sometime probably between July and October. I mean, he was a whirlwind of activity. In 1888, yellow fever returned to Tampa and other peninsula locales, and Plant ordered relief supplies and medicine throughout various parts of Florida. Plant was discouraged by the Florida government that was run by white conservatives, many of whom had been members of the Confederacy, and they were known as Bourbons. In 1888, Plant orders the Tampa Hotel to be built on a larger scale, more like the Ponce de Leon. I think there was some competition there among friends. Mm-hmm. Plant was announcing speedier trains to be built during 1888-89. In 1889, President Cleveland was visiting. He was between his two terms, and Cleveland suggested to Plant that he acquire more land for the Tampa Hotel and to expand it even further. In 1889, Plant, his wife Margaret, and others went to Paris and England, and they bought furnishings for the Tampa Hotel. In 1889, Plant was also running a banana train from South America to the Port of Tampa and then on its way on up to Chicago. It was a combination of his steamships and his railway lines, and the people in Chicago apparently were elated that they had fresh bananas. In 1890, the Tampa Bay Hotel was behind in construction, somewhat brought about by disease. About that same time, Margaret, his wife, had a serious breakdown after the death of her brother. So Plant took her to the Catskills and later Saratoga Springs. In December of 1890, Plant's heir apparent, Walter Chisholm, died. And after Chisholm's death, there were revelations of racial discontent among the Plant workers and claims of Chisholm's sharp business practices in Plant's purchasing division. And that had resulted in financial loss for creditors, workmen, employees, and small businesses. And Plant was pretty embarrassed by that, and I think he once again went to Europe. The Tampa Bay Hotel finally opened January 31st, 1891. Large deposits of phosphates were then discovered near Tampa in 1888. And guess whose train started transporting those phosphates north? In October of 1891, two of Plant's longtime colleagues were forced to resign or were fired after allegations of financial irregularity, and that also involved Southern Express, H.B. Plant Railway, Steamship, and Hotel System. Plant made himself unavailable for questions. In early 1892, at Pico and South Florida Railway board meetings, Flagler, Pullman, and Henry Sanford joined to consider a Tampa to Miami railroad across the Everglades. The South Florida Railway president, James Ingraham, a longtime colleague of Plant's, was sent to explore that route to Miami. We talked about this in the Flagler book last year. Mm-hmm. The directors approved plans at that time for dredging a deeper harbor at the port of Tampa. By April, Plant had learned from Ingraham that a railway across the Everglades to Miami was impractical. Flagler then hired away Ingraham. In May of 1892, Margaret contracted typhoid fever. During the summer, Plant was engaged in numerous business activities, including an alliance with Flagler to control all railway business in Florida. In 1893, Plant proposes a profit-sharing system, which was applauded by the Atlanta Constitution. He also took steps to ensure Black employees felt his concern for their interest. He had previously caved into Tampa white leaders to exclude Blacks as waiters in his Tampa hotel. He now recruited his new head waiter, Wilson Percival, a native of South Carolina who had served in a similar capacity at many premier northern resorts, including at Saratoga Springs. Percival was the head waiter at Tampa Bay Hotel until Plant's death, at which time Flagler hired him away to be the head waiter at Flagler's Breakers Hotel. In January of 1893, Plant executed a new will in favor of unborn grandchildren and restricting the inheritance of his wife and son to $30,000 per annum. In February of 1893, the stock market collapsed following the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad bankruptcy, and so began the Panic of 1893. In the summer of 1893, the Connecticut legislature approved creation of the Southeastern Investment Company, one of Plant's creations, and capital stock could be raised to $20 million. Florida had many lynchings during that time, and the governor was Henry Mitchell, founder of Plant City and a former Confederate officer. Things were not good in Florida. In April 1894, the Plant system was then reorganized to include expanding steamship line and eliminated competition by merging the Plant Steamship Company with the Canadian Atlantic Steamship Company. In September of 1894, a hurricane hit the west coast of Florida, devastating orange and vegetable crops, including the Tampa Bay Hotel. In the winter of 1894-95, there were days of a killer frost blanketing the peninsula and a hard freeze that destroyed the orange crop. And Plant continued to believe that the orange growers would recover because they could plant other crops. Let's see here. The Cuban Revolution broke out in February of 1895. Plant signed some construction contracts to develop a fast-traveling steamship to service Europe. He thought it a good idea to bring investors and tourists from Europe. He also had a new light opera star in whom he was interested, Mademoiselle Jeanne Grenier, I believe. He purchased the Ocala House. He presided over the Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta. And then he had a grand steamship built in honor of this light opera star. And he had visions that she would be able to sing at the New York Metropolitan Opera, and they politely declined his overtures. Planned acquired site for the Bellevue that year. He acquired the Kissimmee Tropical Hotel. He had additional plans drawn up to expand the Tampa Bay Hotel. He became ill that summer, and Flagler transported him back and forth to Branford on Flagler's yacht. The Plant System Relief and Hospital Department was established in July of 1896 to counter threats of unionization. It maintained 4 hospitals, and all new employees were required to join. In 1897, the Bellevue opened. A defense convention was held there. At that time, it was, I guess, decided that if war were to break out with Cuba or with Spain, that the Tampa Bay Hotel would be the appropriate site to stage operations. Plant was optimistic about tourism returning to Florida. It had a downturn, but he seemed optimistic. And then he was expanding his own service, steamship service, to Jamaica and on to Honduras. The USS Maine exploded in early 1898. War was declared in April. The Tampa Bay Hotel did become the general headquarters amidst much griping by one Teddy Roosevelt. In 1899, Spain ceded control of Cuba to the U.S., and then Plant's steamship service to Cuba resumed. In April of that year, Plant's lawyer discovered that his 1893 will was defective. It had been prepared by a Georgia lawyer, but Plant was now a resident of New York. So it was determined by his New York lawyer that the will would be valid in Connecticut, and Plant executed several codicils and tried to establish Connecticut residence, but did not get it done in time, and he died in June of 1899, just shy of his 80th birthday. He was not able to correct the error in the will. After Plant's death, Margaret married a wallpaper manufacturer. She contested the will and received $8.5 million in January 1902. Her longtime physician relocated to the French Riviera. The Plant System rail lines were acquired by the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad. The Tampa Bay Hotel was transferred to the city of Tampa in 1905 and later leased to the University of Tampa. The Bellevue Hotel was kept by Morton and succeeded as a world-class golf destination well into the 20th century. The steamship company was acquired by Henry Flagler and became the Peninsular and Occidental Steamship Company. The Southern Express Company remained independent through World War I, but then was consolidated into Railway Express Company. Assuming Plant's net worth in 1902 was $17 million, and this is a big assumption. The assumption is based on my thinking that her dower interest in the state of New York was 50%. And she got $8.2 million. So if his net worth was, say, $17 million, that would make Margaret's inheritance in 2020 worth $275,570,000. And Plant's estate then would have been worth $551,140,000 at the time of his death. Do we have questions?
Gay, that was a fine presentation. Thank you so much.
All the words run together.
No, not really. I really enjoyed it, and I took many notes myself. I must confess to everyone, I wasn't able to finish the book. It was entirely dense for me, and I was nervous that others were waiting for the book at the library since we only had a few copies available. So I returned it after a week. You know, it would take more than a week to read this book. It would me anyway. But how excellent. Thank you for the summary.
You're quite welcome.
If there are any questions or comments, feel free to unmute yourself. You could also press the space bar to unmute yourself while you speak. No, I have a few little tidbits, and just in our area, there were convict labor camps in this area as well. Southland Trail Cemetery, which is in northern Port Charlotte, northwest Port Charlotte, just past Elgin, in the Elgin / northwest Port Charlotte area. There's actually a convict cemetery there. Just to note on some of the things that were happening, they did happen in this area as well, with the train line that went through here as well, with the Charlotte Harbor and Northern Railroad. So we did have some ties with a lot of the different things that were touched on. Also, if you went to the Legend of Gasparilla presentation that I did, you'll hear a little bit about Henry Plant that ties in with the Gasparilla Festival, and the actual history behind Gasparilla and the legend that was basically created for the railroads. Kind of started off with the Gasparilla Festival in Tampa and a lot of the organizations and industry that was happening with Henry Plant after he passed away and when they started to split up his empire there. So just some little tidbits. It really does touch on a lot of things throughout Florida and also locally with us.
It does. And you know, the Historical Society made a journey to visit the Tampa Bay Hotel, which is now University of Tampa campus, part of the campus. And oh, it is so beautiful. The architecture, Moorish architecture, and the minarets are really kind of a standard for Tampa skyline. It's a beautiful, beautiful building, and the museum is housed there also. Definitely worth a trip.
I have a question. Maybe you all have thought about this. I couldn't decide whether Plant would leave the scene in order to let his underlings deal with the fallout from bad management, bad practices, skullduggery, what have you. I mean, was that why, I'm going to be the good guy. I'm going to leave and let you guys deal with this so it's not to sully my reputation. And then the other thought I had was maybe he was bipolar. Maybe he engaged in all this whirlwind activity for 6-9 months of the year, and then he just went away to, dissemble. I couldn't decide.
I read somewhere.
You muted.
Yeah. He died under mysterious circumstances. Do you know anything about that?
That wasn't revealed in the book, but he declined rather rapidly because he'd been looking at a house in Connecticut one day and he died 3 or 4 days later. He'd been ill several years earlier, but recovered from that and resumed his frenetic pace. I don't know. His wife, Ellen, also, there was no cause of death given for her.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the more interesting parts of the book, and it is dense and the print is small. So thank goodness. Thank goodness the author is a good writer, because it wasn't the writing that was the problem. But I remain fascinated by the years of the Civil War. I think, as we all know, when we read about the Civil War and learn about the Civil War, at least for me, it's always been the perspective of the battlefield or the political spectrum. I don't think I'd ever read something that was so about the day-to-day of wartime. One has the sense when one thinks about the Civil War that, and it was just this huge turmoil, but here is this business going on as usual every every day and why it was going on. And of course, absolutely fascinating that he decided to continue this business from a moral perspective. As we know, in many ways, he was enabling the South. So this thought that maybe he was a Northern spy is interesting. We know during wartime, there are companies and individuals that do profit and make money, and he clearly did. But it was almost that normalcy of reading about a day-to-day in the midst of all that carnage and heartache and turmoil that was so different from any other thing I'd ever read about the war.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the Northern munitions manufacturers were also making money. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idiocy of it is just beyond the pale. You know, let's shoot this stuff south so they can shoot at our sons and nephews.
It's a part of the history that you don't usually get to see. Understanding too where American Express and Wells Fargo came from. Equally interesting.
Yeah.
And Gay, you brought out a lot of it, and it's certainly in the book. He had some very progressive ideas when it came to treating his employees and labor conditions. Not all perfect, obviously, by any means. And I have not been a student of US labor history, so I really don't know where he might or might not have fit with that. But it comes up all the time, as it just did in your remarks, and it was quite interesting. So those were kind of my takeaways from this. Quite interesting.
I think some of it was self-serving because he desperately wanted to avoid strikes because that meant loss of productivity, loss of money. But I'd like to think that he also had a good humanitarian motivation to do these things. You know, if you have happy employees, you have healthy employees, that's going to make your company work better. So, I'd like to see the better part of it if it's there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Speaking of the day-to-day activities of the Civil War, the first book we read, the name of which I cannot remember at the moment, it starts out with the poor people of Georgia who had come to the river because the Confederate troops, I think, were driving cattle across the river because they needed to feed the troops. And these poor the starving citizens were trying to, pair off a cow here or there. I mean, the realities of war, when you get to read about it at that level, it's horrifying.
Yeah, it is.
It's really horrifying. This is a weird aside about the corporate structure of things. The lawsuit that made corporations more like people with the rights of human beings was a lawsuit brought, I think, in the 1880s by Leland Stanford of the Southern Pacific Railway against Santa Clara County. It was non-payment of taxes, and it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the pursuit of that lawsuit and the ruling by the court that these corporations had the same 14th Amendment rights as individual human beings, that was what changed the business makeup for many of these unincorporated associations into the corporate structure. And Leland Stanford is one of the other of the 24 robber barons. Oh, did anybody, I didn't find anywhere any reference to plant diaries or letters, even in the secondary sources cited by Canter Brown. So, there were points in the book where it did somewhat describe what Plant was thinking, or maybe what his emotions were. But I think that could only have been gleaned by George Smythe, who was the author of the earlier biography. Smythe also preached at Plant's funeral, and where Flagler was his #1 pallbearer. But did anybody else see any evidence of reference to diaries or letters or anything?
No, and of course, we didn't on Flagler either.
Yeah.
They're men of mystery, you know, their personal backgrounds, mindset.
Which is amazing. I mean, it makes me want to go to the Plant Library or museum in Tampa to go through the museum there to see what do you have that this man may have recorded. I mean, he surely couldn't have kept all these business transactions in his head all the time. I mean, there's got to be some documentation of his activities and his motivations, perhaps. I don't know. I just find that sort of puzzling.
It is.
Gay?
Yes, ma'am.
It's Mary Beth.
Right.
Just to back up a little bit, the case that you mentioned involving Leland Stanford, the decision of the High Court was based on an error in the header notes. Oh, you know that. Okay. I just thought that was I wondered always whether that was a setup or whether it was an honest mistake. Regardless, it changed everything profoundly.
I think it was a setup. I think that was an unscrupulous justice. I really do think that was a setup.
Yeah, I would have thought the same thing, but I didn't know any more about it.
Anybody else got any thoughts? Anything we can answer?
Hello? Am I on?
Yes.
I thought it was interesting. One of his hotels he built as far south as Punta Gorda, which I don't know whether that was part of a strategy to expand his lines or what, but that was interesting. Also, it's interesting that the city of Tampa, Florida, adopted on its a rendition of his steamship. The city of Tampa bears that symbol.
Oh, okay. There are a lot of parts of this book I skipped over. He did extend his railway lines down to Punta Gorda, where I think he had a 1,200-foot pier, and he had steamship lines that were running from Punta Gorda to Punta Rasa down to Sanibel, and there was some thought about building a hotel out at Captiva even.
Yeah, and Punta Gorda was the southernmost stop for many years until it ended up extending into Fort Myers. So they built, I think they finished that in 1896, that the dock was called the Long Dock. It's known as the Long Dock in this area, and they did have to dredge because Charlotte Harbor isn't as deep as a port as, you know, the south end of Gasparilla Island. But, and that's eventually why when Charlotte Harbor and Northern Railroad built into Gasparilla Island, they stopped using that the port in Punta Gorda. They stopped using the Long Dock because they could use Gasparilla Island. So that's interesting. Yeah, we have a lot of history nearby, and the railroad really did impact a lot of this area. Punta Gorda was Atlantic Coastline Railroad. There was also the railroad line that went through Arcadia. Arcadia was the biggest town. Wherever the train stopped, they built up all these little towns surrounding it. There was a big hotel in Punta Gorda. It did burn down in the 60s. They think that it was possibly arson. Not sure. Nobody's 100% sure on that. But yes, there was a big hotel over there, and it seemed like they were building hotels wherever there were train depots as well, so that they could bring those wealthy visitors to their hotels. So they were making money off of the railroad, and then making money off of the hotel, and then making money off of the town's industry so that they could import and export goods.
Yeah, Plant was very accurate when he said, you know, that Florida is a railroadman's paradise. Everything Floridians need, they have to ship in. They have to sell their products. They've got to ship it out. And all these visitors, in order to get there, they get on the train and they come in and then they go back out again. So you know, it was a gold mine for him, but he knew how to work it. You know, he understood that.
And it's flat. You don't have to worry about trying to dig through mountains or, you know, dynamite mountains or anything like that to put your train line through. Or, I mean, it's just flat space that you're just continuously going. And they did usually end up near some kind of port, some kind of waterway. So, yeah, they have plenty of that.
Barring the swamps, construction was pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
I guess they had washouts when it rained heavily or had hurricanes.
Yeah, they actually used dynamite when they would build roads and things like that through the Everglades, which is interesting. But Florida actually used, I think it was the third most amount of dynamite that was used in the United States at one point in time. So that's another topic, but interesting fact. It's not always as easy to build through the swamp, but getting down here to this point, you know, before you get to just the swamps of the Everglades, or, you know, in the middle of the state, I feel like there's a lot more swampy area. There's a lot more lakes and things like that. So yeah, he would go along the shorelines.
I understand there was one heir of Henry. He had a grandson by the same name who actually died on his yacht that was moored off the coast of Miami, died at a young age of 42. Does anyone know of any other heirs?
No, I think that was his only heir. I'm fairly certain of that.
Yeah, he never, I understand he never left the yacht. He almost stayed on he lived on the yacht, so to speak.
Huh. Well,
not bad.
Yeah, I guess. Seems pretty limiting, though. You know, it seemed that Plant had this infatuation with these young opera stars, but I don't think he was ever consummated in any sense that might have produced another heir. I think he was just fascinated with them, my impression from the book. Well, there's nothing else we can tell you.
No, that was a good report, though. I like the summary, Dave. Thank you very much.
Quite well.
Well, we can probably bring this to a conclusion. We thank you all for being with us today. Unless anyone has any further remarks. I don't believe so.
I did. I'm sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Morton Plant was another son of his. Is that correct? Or
he had two sons. One died early on when he was.
And Morton obviously redeemed himself, I guess.
Yes. Yes.
He matured. You know, there's a big hospital named after him, Morton Plant Hospital in Clearwater, I guess.
Okay.
And I graduated from H.B. Plant High School in Tampa.
Oh, wow.
Well, Morton Plant ran the Bellevue. I
Right.
guess that's part of the
heritage. Yeah.
So, yeah, wow. Yeah. Morton became a trusted employee, I think the book said, in 1882, and I'm blanking on what year it was built, but wasn't the Bellevue still around in the 1960s?
Yes, I think they renovated it still today. I think it's still in operation to some extent, at least a restaurant or something.
Was it purchased by a group of Japanese investors in maybe the 80s?
You know, I really don't know.
Okay. It's a wooden structure, isn't it? The restaurant?
Yeah.
Brown?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just remember it being white, but it was always exciting to go there, you know, and eat in the restaurant. And, yeah, pretty. Yeah.
This is Ralph and Joanne Allen. We fantastically enjoyed the presentation Thank you, thank
Okay.
you, thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Very nice.
Yeah, I would add comments. I think it was outstanding, the format today. I thought it was extremely good. And Gay, thank you. It's very clear that you not only love the book, but you put together a wonderful summary for us. So it left us speechless, I guess.
Well, then you go read the book. I mean, I kept, as I'm going through there, I'm thinking, God, did I say that right? But it's a pleasure to try to bring, interesting history to life.
Jean? Oh, Jean, did you have more to say? No? Okay. All right, well, I think we can conclude for today. We thank you all for being with us. Of course, Gay, we thank you. And you will be joining us, I hope, on April 5th when we discuss Devil in the Grove. And Randy Hicks will be our moderator. So we hope to see you then, and stay tuned to our website where you will find our calendar of events, because we have some very interesting things coming up in the next, actually this week and following. So check out our website for our calendar. Thank you all so very much for being with us. We conclude today.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.